Very good morning to you, Marley.
Good morning, Mike.
Are you expecting tariffs to be forthcoming from the Trump administration? Because I'm not sure it's going to happen.
Well, there were tariffs last time round, particularly on steel and aluminium, and the president-elect has said that there could well be tariffs on all imports to the US of up to 10 or 20%, just as a kind of baseline starting point. So, I mean, we don't know for sure, and that could be something that Trump decides not to focus on. But certainly the risk of tariffs on the UK is quite significant, and I think that the government should be engaging closely with the new administration to try to avoid that, and even more so to try to actually negotiate a full free trade agreement with the US as well.
Right. But, I mean, how would they go about doing that? Because it's very clear that the Trump administration has got friends around the world in terms of the people that he's invited to the inauguration. He likes the leaders from Brazil. He likes the leaders from Argentina. Doesn't like China very much. He's threatening them with all sorts of tariffs on cars and car production and stuff like that. He doesn't like the Mexicans very much. He quite likes the Italians in terms of Giorgia Meloni. You know, he's got a few favourites, hasn't he?
Well, he obviously has personal relationships and kind of political allegiances. Obviously, there is, I think, quite a strong case, though, for a UK-US free trade agreement. I mean, the UK and the US have a long-standing trade relationship, significant amounts of imports and exports. I mean, the US exports a lot to the UK in machinery and in transport equipment. So there are clear benefits economically for both the US and the UK for a trade agreement. And of course, we know from last time round that that Trump was interested in a free trade agreement back then, post-Brexit. So I think it's reasonable for the UK government to signal that they're open to doing a deal this time as well.
Yeah, sure. And as far as the way that Britain's approach should be handled, I mean, you said that obviously the US is one part of the equation, but also so is the EU. Keir Starmer said the other day when he was announcing the AI sort of breakthrough that he said we're in a happy position here because we're not tied in with the EU. We're sort of sitting in an island all of our own, so we can make our own deals on all manner of things, whether it's AI, whether it's trade and whatever. So would you say that that was a good thing?
Well, I think it's definitely possible that we could do a deal with both the EU and the US. You can strengthen the relationship with the EU and also secure an FTA with the US. It's not impossible to do both those things at once. Now, there are certain areas where there are significant tensions, and I think the most obvious one is on food standards, because in the past the US has pushed for different food standards for the UK so that it can allow exports of chlorinated chicken and so on, as I think was discussed a lot around the Brexit debate. Now,
that all turned out to be a bit of a red herring, if you'll pardon the analogy, didn't it?
Well, it's unclear whether I think the US does want to push the UK on these standards. So, but it's not necessarily a requirement of any free trade agreement. We don't know. It depends where the negotiations go. And we do know that the UK and the government's been clear that it wants a veterinary agreement with the EU. Now, a veterinary agreement is likely to require some level of harmonisation of standards between the UK and the EU. So, in that respect, there is a trade-off. Now, we've said pretty clearly we think that the UK needs to prioritise the relationship with the EU on this area because it's so important, and there's a real potential for us to boost our exports to the EU in this area. And of course, also it's worth saying that the public are strongly supportive of the current food standards we have. So there isn't much appetite for lowering our food standards for a deal with the US. But we think it's still possible to negotiate something with the US. Just the UK needs to have clear red lines on issues like these.
Well, I wonder what the effect on food standards will be when all these farms start shutting down, when the inheritance tax rules come in.
I mean, I think that the farmers actually have been pretty clear, and NFU have been pretty clear that, regardless of these domestic issues, they are committed to the high food standards in the UK, and they're a bit nervous actually about doing these deals because what they don't want is to see a reduction of food standards. And I think that's something the government needs to be clear about. You can do these deals. We have other free trade agreements without reducing our food standards, and so I think the UK needs to be clear about that. And again, that would, I think, help with our relationship with the EU, because I think if we were to lower our food standards to the US, then that would risk, I think, any progress on agri-food relationships with the EU. And we know at the moment that exporters are having a real hard time with it, because we have all these different checks on goods that go from the UK to the EU because of the new relationship post-Brexit.
Yeah, sure. Let's have a look at what Joe Biden had to say in his final address. He started warning about a dangerous oligarchy.
That's why my farewell address tonight, I want to warn the country of some things that give me great concern. And this is a dangerous and that's a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a very few ultra-wealthy people. And the dangerous consequences if their abuse of power is left unchecked. Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy.
And surely he's just described every president since the beginning of time, hasn't he?
Well, I think this is probably where you and I will differ, Mike. I mean, I presume he's referring to the kind of the social media companies, and in particular Elon Musk and so on. I think there is, a concern here that the power of these tech companies is oversized and is dictating to some extent US policy, and in particular in the context of the report we have out today, dictating policy abroad as well. And I do think another important thing that the UK needs to be clear about in any free trade discussions is that we will maintain our own standards on online safety, because what we can't do is be pushed around and say we're going to lower our standards on online safety just because we're being expected to from the US administration and the tech companies over there. We have our own sovereign standards which we need to protect.
Sure, but there's a difference between online safety and freedom of speech, and never the twain shall meet, and it seems to depend on which side of the political divide you're on as to whether or not censorship is a good thing, and whether or not the sort of the attachment of political views to whatever is supposedly called fact-checking is worth doing. And of course, I mean, as far as American presidents are concerned, it's always been the concentration of a very small number of people who are incredibly powerful and very wealthy. You know as well as I do, if you know as much about American politics as I do, that money buys you power. And that's what's been happening in the Senate for years and years and years. Everybody asks the question, how did Joe Biden become a multi-millionaire when he's only been making, a relatively small six-figure salary most of his career? The answer is, pork barrel politics. People make money becoming politicians. No president has ever left the White House and not been a millionaire, having not necessarily been one when he went in.
Well, I think it's a fair point. I mean, the US has a long history of this. Although there are some, kind of admirable exceptions, like Jimmy Carter. I thought, had quite a kind of impressive presidential.
Well, he
career.
did, but he was still a millionaire, though. He was still a very wealthy individual.
Yeah, and look, I mean, obviously there's a long history of...
He wasn't the humble peanut farmer that everybody talks about.
In relation to democracy. But I think the concern here is specifically about these companies, and in particular in the context of the relationship between the UK and the US. What we can't have a situation is where the UK, obviously we can have a debate in the UK about online safety versus freedom of speech. But what I think is unhealthy is if it's the US companies and the US administration that's dictating our own policy. Just as we had a debate about with Brexit, we wanted to, there was a debate and the argument became that the UK should leave the EU, and that was about our own sovereignty. Just as the same applies here, right? We have our own sovereignty, and if we decide to introduce laws like the Online Safety Act, then I think it's not right for us to be bullied into a different position or coerced into a different position just because of some overseas companies who have a different view on this. So I think we do need to maintain our position. I don't see
any sign of that happening, though, because I mean, even Elon Musk he's not even bullying Donald Trump. When he started differing with him on immigration, for example, Trump stuck to his guns. Trump's people stuck to their guns, and Musk went away, which is what he does.
Absolutely, yeah, and it may be that this doesn't come up, and we don't know. This is at this point is speculation, but there have been some suggestions that this could be a condition of any free trade agreement. Of course, that would be unusual, and it's certainly not necessarily the case that this would be a part of any free trade discussions. Normally, you don't get these types of discussions in a free trade agreement. They would focus on areas such as reducing barriers in goods and services trade, and as I said, I think there's a real potential there for a UK-US deal. And the UK is a very stable partner of the US. The US hasn't done many free trade deals recently, and I think there is some appetite in Congress for a deal like this. And of course, we know that the president formally talked about a trade deal with the UK. So there's a real potential here. I think the key is that the UK needs to maintain quite clear red lines on things like this, and engage openly and early on in the period of the administration, and hopefully a deal can be done.
Let's hope so. Very good to talk to you. Marley Morris, thank you very much indeed. Associate Director for Trade, Migration and Communities at the IPPR.